Security, remove her. 3 words that would cost Vera Bradford everything. At her son's luxury Hamptons wedding, surrounded by champagne towers and string quartets, Vera pointed a diamond-laden finger at a calm black woman in a simple navy dress. The woman didn't beg, didn't argue, didn't even raise her voice. She simply turned and walked the manicured grounds like she'd memorized every stone pathway, every rose bush, every carved fountain, because she had. When a pale-faced valet whispered, "Miss Naomi," the color drained from Vera's face. The intruder was Naomi Carter. And this wasn't just any estate. Before we continue, I invite you to follow this story to the very end. And please like and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The late August sun hung heavy over the Bradford estate in the Hamptons, casting golden light across 300 guests dressed in silk and summer linen. White chairs lined the lawn in perfect rows. A string quartet played Vivaldi beneath a rose-covered arch. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and canapes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything was orchestrated, flawless, expensive, the kind of wedding that would appear in glossy magazines with captions about timeless elegance and old money charm. Vera Bradford stood near the main terrace, resplendent in a champagne-colored Chanel suit, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She held court among a cluster of similarly dressed women, their laughter tinkling like wind chimes as they discussed vacation homes in Tuscany and upcoming charity galas. This was Vera's triumph. Her son Evan, 38 and finally settling down, was marrying Chloe Morrison, daughter of a Connecticut real estate magnate. It was the merger of 2 families who understood power, legacy, and the proper way things should be done. The flowers alone cost $40,000, Vera was saying, gesturing toward the cascading arrangements of peonies and garden roses. I had them flown in from... She stopped mid-sentence. A woman was walking up the main driveway. Not arriving in a car, not part of the catering staff, just walking with a measured, unhurried stride, wearing a simple navy dress that looked like it came from a department store rather than a designer boutique. She was black, perhaps in her late 40s, with natural hair pulled back in a low bun and minimal jewelry, just small gold earrings and a watch. She carried a small leather clutch and wore sensible flats. She looked, Vera thought with immediate distaste, entirely out of place. "Who is that?" one of Vera's friends murmured. Vera's eyes narrowed. The woman was walking past the valet station, past the sign directing guests to the ceremony area, moving instead toward the east garden with a confidence that sent a prickle of irritation down Vera's spine. She wasn't lost. She wasn't hesitant. She was walking like she knew exactly where she was going. "Excuse me," Vera said sharply, leaving her circle of friends and striding across the lawn with quick, purposeful steps. Her heels sank slightly into the manicured grass, but she didn't break stride. "Excuse me." The woman stopped and turned. Her face was calm, composed, with intelligent dark eyes that met Vera's without a flicker of anxiety or deference. "The ceremony is that way," Vera said, pointing back toward the rows of white chairs, her tone making it clear this wasn't helpful information but a correction. "If you're a guest." "I'm not here for the ceremony," the woman said. Her voice was quiet, measured, with a slight rasp that suggested years of speaking with authority. Vera's jaw tightened. "Then I'm afraid you need to leave. This is a private event." "I understand that." The woman's gaze moved past Vera, tracking across the gardens, the fountain, the old oak tree near the eastern wall. She seemed to be cataloging every detail, her expression unreadable. "Security!" Vera called, her voice rising. 2 men in dark suits materialized from near the house, moving quickly across the lawn. "Please escort this woman off the property." One of the security guards, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, approached with his hand raised in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to..." He stopped abruptly when he got close enough to see her face clearly. His expression shifted, confusion flickering across his features. "Miss Naomi?" The woman, Naomi, gave him a small, sad smile. "Hello, Marcus. It's been a long time." Marcus looked like he'd been struck. He glanced back at his partner, then at Vera, then back at Naomi. I didn't know you were..." "It's all right," Naomi said gently. I understand you're just doing your job. Vera's irritation flared into anger. What is happening here? Do you know this person? Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, then said carefully, Mrs. Bradford, I think there might be some— I don't care about complications, Vera snapped. Remove her. Now. A small crowd was gathering. Guests had noticed the commotion, turning away from their champagne and conversations to watch the drama unfolding on the lawn. Vera could feel their eyes, their curiosity, and it made her fury burn hotter. This was her son's wedding day, her perfect day, and this woman, this complete stranger, was disrupting everything. Naomi reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card, extending it to Marcus. If there's any question, you can call this number. Vera snatched the card before Marcus could take it. She glanced at it, then let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A lawyer? Of course. Let me guess. You're here to serve someone papers? On my son's wedding day? I'm not here to serve papers, Naomi said. Then what are you here for? Naomi's eyes moved past Vera again, settling on the main house, a sprawling Georgian estate with white columns and tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. I came to see what they've done with it. Who's done with what? The estate, Naomi said simply. The house, the gardens, all of it. Vera felt something cold settle in her chest. The way this woman was looking at the property, not like a trespasser or a curious onlooker, but with a kind of intimate familiarity, like she was remembering something personal, set off alarm bells. You need to leave, Vera said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Right now, or I will have you arrested for trespassing. Naomi met her eyes for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking back toward the driveway. Marcus exhaled, his shoulders sagging with visible relief. The other security guard wiped his forehead. Who was that? Someone in the crowd asked. Nobody, Vera said firmly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. An uninvited guest who got lost. It's handled. But as she watched Naomi's retreating figure, that cold feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. The way the woman had looked at the house, the way Marcus had reacted, the calm, almost pitying expression in those dark eyes. Vera shook it off. This was her son's wedding day, and she wasn't about to let some strange woman ruin it. She returned to her friends, accepted a fresh glass of champagne, and threw herself back into the role of gracious hostess. The ceremony began on schedule. Evan and Chloe exchanged vows beneath the rose arch, their voices carrying across the perfect lawn. Guests dabbed at their eyes. The photographer captured every moment. Everything was beautiful, flawless, exactly as Vera had planned. Then, as the newlyweds walked back down the aisle to thunderous applause, Vera caught sight of something that made her champagne glass nearly slip from her fingers. Naomi was back. She was sitting on a stone bench at the far edge of the reception area, partially hidden by a large hydrangea bush. She had a leather briefcase now, resting on her lap, and she was opening it with deliberate, unhurried movements. She pulled out a stack of papers, crossed one leg over the other, and began reading as if she were sitting in a quiet office rather than crashing a wedding. Vera's face flushed hot. She set down her glass and marched across the lawn, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. Several guests noticed and began following at a distance, drawn by the promise of confrontation like sharks scenting blood. You, Vera hissed when she reached the bench. I told you to leave. Naomi looked up from her papers. I did leave, and now I'm back. This is private property. You're trespassing. Actually, Naomi said, returning her attention to the documents, I don't think I am. Vera felt her hands clench into fists. That's it. I'm calling the police. Feel free. The calm in Naomi's voice, the complete absence of fear or concern, was infuriating. Vera pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking with rage. Yes, I need police at the Bradford estate on Ocean Road, she said sharply when the dispatcher answered. We have a trespasser who is refusing to leave and disrupting a private event. As Vera gave the details, more guests gathered. Chloe's father, Richard Morrison, pushed through the crowd, his face red with indignation. What the hell is going on here? An uninvited guest, Vera said, ending the call. Who seems to think she has some kind of right to be here? Richard looked at Naomi with open contempt. Security should have handled this already. They tried, someone muttered. Then try harder, Richard barked. He turned to Marcus, who had appeared again at the edge of the crowd. Get her out of here. Physically, if necessary. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable. Sir, I really think we should wait for... I don't care what you think. You're paid to provide security, so provide it. Marcus approached Naomi slowly, as if walking towards something fragile or dangerous. Miss Naomi, please, you're making this very difficult. Naomi carefully placed her papers back in the briefcase and stood. She was shorter than Marcus by nearly a foot, but something in her bearing made her seem taller. Marcus, do you remember the summer you worked here? You were, what, 16? Marcus's face went pale. Please don't. You used to help my grandmother in the garden. She taught you how to prune the roses, how to tell when the tomatoes were ready. You told her you wanted to join the police force someday. She was so proud of you. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even Richard Morrison's bluster had died away, replaced by confused attention. Your grandmother? Vera said slowly. What are you talking about? Naomi turned to face her. My grandmother was Sarah Washington. She and my grandfather, James Washington, owned this estate for 43 years before they died. This was their home. It's where I spent my summers as a child. The statement landed like a bomb. Vera laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's absurd. The Bradfords have owned this property for 8 years. We bought it from a development company that had purchased it from the previous owners. The previous owners, Naomi said quietly, were my grandparents. And before their deaths was finalized properly, before probate was completed, before their will was fully executed, the property was sold through questionable legal channels. Questionable? Vera's voice rose. We have a clear title, legal documents. Everything was properly... Was it? Naomi opened her briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. Because I've spent the last 3 years working with property lawyers, title researchers, and estate attorneys to trace exactly what happened. And what I found is a chain of transactions that bypassed the rightful heirs, namely, me and my mother, through a series of shell companies, forged signatures, and conveniently expedited probate proceedings. She spread several documents across the bench. Even from a distance, Vera could see official seals, legal stamps, highlighted passages. You're insane, Richard Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm methodical, Naomi corrected. I'm patient, and I'm very, very thorough. A waiter approached nervously with a tray of champagne. Vera waved him away irritably, but Naomi's eyes followed him, followed all the staff, actually, as they moved through the crowd. Her gaze settled on an older woman in a catering uniform who was standing near the terrace, clutching a tray with white knuckles. Hello, Mrs. Chen, Naomi called out. The woman, Mrs. Chen, made a small, choked sound. Her eyes filled with tears. You remember me? Naomi asked gently. Mrs. Chen nodded, unable to speak. Who is that? Chloe Morrison demanded. That's Helen Chen, one of the other staff members whispered. She's been with the estate for 20 years, started when the Washingtons still... The sentence trailed off as the implication settled over the crowd like a cold fog. Vera felt control of the situation slipping through her fingers like sand. This is ridiculous. You can't just show up at a private event with some conspiracy theory about property theft and... It's not a conspiracy theory when I have documented evidence, Naomi said. She pulled out another set of papers. These ones older, yellowed at the edges. These are my grandparents' original property records. The deed with their signatures. The will that left everything to my mother, and upon her death, to me. Tax records showing continuous ownership from 1959 to 2004. Then where have you been for 8 years? Vera challenged. If this property is so important to you, why did you wait until now? Naomi's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something old and painful. Because 8 years ago, I was in federal court. I was prosecuting a series of complex financial fraud cases that took everything I had. I was fighting battles I couldn't walk away from. And by the time I had the resources and time to look into my family's affairs, I discovered what had been done. Federal court? Someone in the crowd said. Are you a prosecutor? Was, Naomi said. Now I'm on the bench. The confusion that statement caused rippled through the gathered guests. People glanced at each other, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Vera seized on the ambiguity like a lifeline. On the bench? What's that supposed to mean? You're a judge at some small claims court? Naomi closed her briefcase with a quiet click. I'm a United States federal judge for the Southern District of New York. I was appointed 4 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Richard Morrison laughed, a forced, nervous sound. That's... You expect us to believe you're a federal judge? I don't expect anything, Naomi said. I'm simply stating facts. Then prove it, Vera demanded. Show us identification, something official. Naomi reached into her clutch and pulled out a small leather wallet. She flipped it open to reveal an official ID card with the seal of the United States District Court. The name read, Honran Naomi Carter, United States District Judge. Several people in this crowd leaned in to look. Someone gasped. Another person pulled out their phone, clearly intending to Google her name. Carter, Vera said slowly. You said your grandparents were Washington. Carter is my married name. I kept it after my divorce because it's the name on all my professional credentials. Naomi's voice remained steady, patient, like she was explaining something to a child. My maiden name was Washington. Naomi Elizabeth Washington. My mother was Margaret Washington, daughter of James and Sarah Washington, who purchased this property in 1959. The phones were out now, multiple guests searching, reading, their faces registering shock as they found federal court records, news articles about appointments and major cases, photographs of Naomi in judicial robes. It's true, someone whispered. She's listed on the federal court website. Oh my God, another voice said. She presided over the Meridian Bank fraud case. That was huge. Vera felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she fought to maintain control. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that we own this property. We have legal title. We've paid taxes for 8 years. Whatever happened before that was fraud, Naomi said flatly. Systematic, deliberate fraud that benefited several people, including the development company that sold you this estate at below market value. We didn't know anything about that. I'm not saying you did. Naomi's voice softened slightly. But unknowing participation in fraud doesn't erase the fraud itself, and it doesn't erase my family's claim. Your claim is decades old, Richard Morrison interjected. There are statutes of limitations, not on this kind of systematic fraud involving shell companies and forged documents, Naomi said, and not when the rightful heir was systematically kept in the dark through deliberate manipulation of public records. She pulled out yet another document, this one looking official and recent, with court seals and signature lines. This is a preliminary injunction I filed in federal court 3 days ago. It freezes any transfer of this property pending a full hearing on the matter. Your lawyers should have received notice yesterday. Vera felt ice water flood her veins. You sued us? I sued the fraudulent chain of title, Naomi corrected. You're named as interested parties, but the actual defendants are the shell companies and individuals involved in the original fraud. I'm simply seeking to restore proper ownership. This is extortion, Vera nearly shouted. You're trying to steal our home. I'm trying to reclaim my home, Naomi said, and for the first time real emotion crept into her voice. The home where my grandmother taught me to play piano in that music room, where my grandfather showed me the constellations from that upper balcony, where my mother got married beneath that same oak tree you're using as a photo backdrop. She pointed at the massive old oak near the eastern wall, its branches spreading like a cathedral ceiling. Several wedding guests were posing for photos beneath it at that exact moment. That tree, Naomi continued, has our initials carved into it. J.W. loves S.W. 1959. My grandfather carved it the year they bought the property. It's still there, about 6 feet up on the north side, partially hidden by bark growth. A few people actually went to look. A moment later, someone shouted, "Holy shit, it's here!" The atmosphere was shifting, the crowd's sympathy beginning to turn. People were looking at Vera and Richard with new uncertainty, glancing back at Naomi with something approaching respect or fear or both. Vera could feel her perfect day crumbling, and rage replaced her panic. "Get out!" she hissed at Naomi. "Get out right now before the police arrive and arrest you." "For what?" Naomi asked calmly. "I haven't trespassed on property I legally claim ownership of. I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't disrupted the ceremony. I sat quietly at the edge while you continued with your event. All I've done is present documented evidence of fraud." "You've ruined my son's wedding." "Your son," Naomi said slowly, "chose to get married on stolen land. That's not something I did to him. That's something you did." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Vera opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a new voice cut through the tension. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Evan Bradford pushed through the crowd, still in his tuxedo, his new wife Chloe clutching his arm. His face was flushed, whether from champagne or anger or both. "We're trying to have our first dance, and everyone's out here watching some kind of fight?" Vera turned to her son, trying to compose her face into something resembling motherly concern. "It's nothing, darling, just a confused woman who needs to—" She stopped because Evan was staring at Naomi with an expression Vera couldn't quite read. His face had gone pale, and he seemed frozen, his mouth slightly open. "Judge Carter?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Bradford, it's been a while." "You two know each other?" Vera demanded. Evan didn't answer. He was still staring at Naomi, and now Vera could read his expression clearly. It was fear mixed with something like shame. "Evan?" Chloe tugged at his arm. "Who is this?" "Judge Naomi Carter," Evan said hoarsely. "Southern District of New York. She presided over my case." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone who heard them. "Your case?" Vera repeated. "What case? Evan, what are you talking about?" Evan's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, in a voice drained of all color, he said, 6 years ago. Money laundering charges. I was facing 15 to 20 years. The crowd erupted in whispers. Chloe stumbled backward, her face white. Richard Morrison looked like he might have a stroke. Naomi remained perfectly still, her expression neutral. Mr. Bradford pled guilty to 3 counts and cooperated fully with federal investigators. In exchange for his testimony against his co-defendants and his agreement to make full restitution, I sentenced him to 18 months of home confinement and 5 years probation. "You knew about this?" Chloe's voice was shrill, directed at Evan. "You told me you'd never been in trouble with the law." It was sealed," Evan stammered. "Part of my plea agreement. As long as I completed probation successfully, the records would be sealed." "Sealed from the public," Naomi clarified, "not from federal judges or law enforcement." Vera felt like the earth had opened beneath her feet. Her son, her perfect son, who went to Yale, who worked in finance, who was supposed to represent everything the Bradford family stood for. He'd been convicted of federal crimes? And this woman, this judge, had been the one to sentence him? "You came here for revenge," Vera said, her voice shaking. "You're angry about something from the past, and you're coming after my family." "Actually," Naomi said quietly, "your son is one of my success stories. He cooperated fully with investigators, helped dismantle a significant money laundering operation, made complete restitution to the victims, and has stayed clean for 6 years. He did everything right after making a serious mistake. I have nothing but respect for how he handled his rehabilitation." She turned to Evan. "You completed your probation 2 years ago, correct?" Evan nodded mutely. "And you've maintained steady employment, stayed away from any illegal activity, and by all accounts lived a law-abiding life?" Another nod. "Then congratulations," Naomi said. "You're exactly what the justice system is supposed to produce. Someone who made a mistake, faced consequences, and became a better person." The gentleness in her voice seemed to break something in Evan. His shoulders sagged, and he looked at the ground. "Then why are you here?" Chloe demanded, tears streaming down her face. "If you're so proud of him, why would you show up at his wedding and I'm not here because of your husband," Naomi said. "I didn't even know this was his wedding until I arrived. I'm here because this is my family's estate, and I'm in the process of legally reclaiming it. The fact that your wedding happened to be scheduled here today is purely coincidental." She looked at Vera. You want to know why I came today specifically? Because I wanted to see it. One more time. I wanted to walk the gardens my grandmother planted. I wanted to see the fountain my grandfather restored. I wanted to stand in the place where my mother used to play as a child, before the lawyers and the courts and the inevitable battle over every square foot of this land begins. I wanted one quiet moment to remember what it was. Her voice had thickened slightly, the first real crack in her composure. I didn't come to ruin anything. I just came to remember. The crowd was silent now, watching. Several people looked genuinely moved. Even some of Vera's friends were wiping their eyes. But Vera felt no sympathy. Only rage, white-hot and desperate, at this woman who had appeared out of nowhere and demolished her perfect day, exposed her son's secrets, and claimed ownership of everything Vera had spent 8 years turning into her own personal sanctuary. "You don't get to do this," Vera said, her voice low and venomous. "You don't get to show up and play the victim and expect everyone to feel sorry for you. You claim this property was stolen? Prove it in court. Until then, you're trespassing on my estate, disrupting my son's wedding, and I want you gone." Naomi studied her for a long moment. Then she carefully gathered all her documents, placed them back in her briefcase, and stood. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go." She walked toward the driveway, her footsteps measured and calm. Staff members watched her pass with expressions ranging from guilt to anguish. Mrs. Chen was openly crying. Marcus looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. As Naomi reached the edge of the property, she paused and turned back one final time. Her eyes swept across the house, the gardens, the gathered guests in their expensive clothes and careful makeup. "This place deserves better than what's been done to it," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "My grandparents built something beautiful here. They opened it to the community, hosted charity events, employed dozens of local families. They believed wealth came with responsibility. When I take it back, and I will take it back, I'm going to honor that legacy." Then she was gone, disappearing down the driveway into the late afternoon shadows. The party tried to recover, but the damage was done. Guests whispered in clusters. Chloe was having what appeared to be a very intense conversation with Evan near the terrace. Richard Morrison was on his phone, presumably calling lawyers. The staff moved mechanically, their earlier efficiency replaced by distracted uncertainty. Vera stood alone near the stone bench where Naomi had sat, staring at the spot as if she could erase what had happened through sheer force of will. Marcus approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Bradford, I'm sorry. I didn't know she would—" "Did you know?" Vera demanded. "About the property? About her grandparents?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I knew the Washingtons owned the estate before. Everyone who worked here back then knew. But I was just a kid. I didn't know anything about what happened after they died, about any fraud or legal issues. I just knew that one year they were here, and the next year they weren't, and the property got sold." "Why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what? That the previous owners were a black family? Would that have mattered?" Marcus's voice held an edge that Vera wasn't used to hearing from staff. "You bought the place legally, as far as anyone knew. The rest was just history." History, Vera thought bitterly. That's exactly what Naomi Carter was trying to resurrect. The police finally arrived 30 minutes later, 2 officers who took statements and looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. They confirmed that Naomi Carter was indeed a federal judge, that there was an active civil case about the property, and that technically she hadn't committed any crime by showing up and presenting legal documents. "But she disrupted a private event," Vera insisted. "She sat quietly on a bench," one officer said carefully. "By multiple accounts, you approached her, ma'am. She didn't force her way into the ceremony or reception. She didn't threaten anyone. And given that she's claiming legal ownership of the property, we can't exactly charge her with trespassing. So she can just come back whenever she wants? Until the court decides otherwise? Potentially, yes." It was nearly dark by the time the wedding limped to its conclusion. The first dance happened. The cake was cut. But the joy had been sucked out of everything, replaced by tension and whispered conversations and the occasional burst of raised voices as various guests argued about what they'd witnessed. Vera drank too much champagne and avoided Evan's eyes and smiled until her face ached. When the last guest finally left and the caterers began cleaning up, she walked through the empty house, touching the furniture she'd chosen, the artwork she'd hung, the renovations she'd overseen. Everything bore her mark now, her taste, her vision. But underneath it all, she could suddenly feel something else, the ghost of other people's lives, other people's choices, other people's love for this place. She pushed the thought away angrily and went to bed. But sleep wouldn't come, and when she finally did drift off, she dreamed of a woman in a navy dress, walking through the gardens like she owned them, because Vera was beginning to realize with cold dread she just might. The Monday morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Vera's bedroom, but she'd been awake for hours, staring at the ornate ceiling molding she'd had custom installed 3 years ago. Her head throbbed from too much champagne and too little sleep. Beside her, Gerald Bradford snored softly, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. Vera slipped out of bed and padded downstairs in her silk robe, her bare feet silent on the marble floors. The house was immaculate. The cleaning crew had worked until nearly midnight, removing all traces of the wedding. But they couldn't remove the memory of Naomi Carter sitting on that stone bench, calmly dismantling Vera's entire world with a briefcase full of legal documents. Coffee. She needed coffee and her lawyer. She was halfway through dialing Richard Morrison's attorney when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made her stomach clench. David Hutchins, the real estate lawyer who'd handled their purchase of the estate 8 years ago. "David," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just about to call you." "Vera." His voice was tight, professional in a way that immediately set her on edge. "I need you and Gerald to come to my office this morning, 10 o'clock. Don't be late." "What's this about?" There was a pause. "You know what it's about. Judge Carter filed formal notice with the county registrar this morning. The title on your property is now officially disputed. We need to discuss your options." "My options?" Vera's hand tightened around her phone. "David, you assured us the title was clean. You did the research. You said there were no encumbrances, no liens, no—" "The title search I conducted 8 years ago was thorough based on the information available at the time," David said, his lawyer voice in full force now. "But Judge Carter has unearthed documents that weren't in the public record. Documents that suggest the chain of title was compromised through fraudulent means before the property ever reached the development company you purchased from. So fix it. That's what we pay you for." "Vera," David's voice dropped. "She's a federal judge. She has resources and credibility that most plaintiffs don't have. And from what my colleague showed me this morning, her case is extremely well documented. This isn't going to be a simple matter of filing a motion to dismiss." Vera closed her eyes. 10 o'clock. "We'll be there." She ended the call and stood in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by the Italian marble countertops and custom cabinetry that had cost a fortune, and felt the first real flutter of fear in her chest. Gerald came downstairs 20 minutes later, already dressed in golf clothes, his silver hair still damp from the shower. "Morning, darling. Terrible business yesterday, but these things happen. Nothing a good round of golf won't cure." "We have a meeting at 10, Vera said flatly, "with David Hutchins." Gerald's jovial expression faltered. "The lawyer? What for?" "Because that woman wasn't bluffing. She filed official notice. Our title is disputed." "Well, that's ridiculous. We'll get it thrown out. Simple matter of—" "Gerald." Vera set her coffee cup down hard enough that liquid sloshed over the rim. "For once in your life, take something seriously. This woman is a federal judge. She has documentation, she has witnesses, and she apparently has a very personal grudge against what happened to her family's property." "Personal grudge?" Gerald's face reddened. "We didn't do anything wrong. We bought this place fair and square. Tell that to the judge when we're in court." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to fully examine. David Hutchins' office was in downtown Southampton, occupying the top floor of a building with views of the ocean. Normally, Vera found the place soothing, all dark wood and leather chairs and the subtle scent of old money. Today, it felt like a funeral home. David was waiting in his conference room with 2 other lawyers Vera had never met. One was a younger woman with sharp eyes and a tablet computer. The other was an older man whose gray beard and expensive suit suggested he specialized in complex litigation. "Vera, Gerald, thank you for coming on short notice," David said, gesturing to chairs. "This is Melissa Park. She specializes in title disputes. and James Thornton, who handles high-stakes civil litigation. How high stakes are we talking? Gerald asked, lowering himself into a chair. James Thornton opened a folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Judge Carter is seeking full restoration of title to the property, retroactive to the date of her grandparents' death in 2004. She's also seeking damages for fair market rental value for the 8 years you've occupied the property, plus compensation for improvements made to the estate using what she claims are stolen resources. Vera felt the blood drain from her face. Rental value? We own this property. We've been paying taxes on it for 8 years. Paying taxes on disputed property doesn't establish valid ownership, Melissa Park said gently, especially if the original transfer was fraudulent. How much are we talking about? Gerald's voice had lost all its bluster. Melissa tapped on her tablet. Conservative estimate? Between rental value, appreciation, and her claim for improvements, you could be looking at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. And that's if you settle. If this goes to trial and she wins, the court could add punitive damages for the fraud, even though you weren't directly involved. Gerald made a strangled sound. Vera just stared at the papers spread across the conference table. But we didn't commit fraud, she said. We bought from a legitimate development company. We had lawyers. We had title insurance. And your title insurance company is already distancing themselves, David said. I spoke with them this morning. They're arguing that the fraud occurred before the property entered the commercial market, which means it falls outside their coverage period. That's insane. That's insurance law. James Thornton leaned forward. Here's what we're facing. Judge Carter has documentation showing that her grandparents' will left the property to her mother, Margaret Washington. Margaret died in 2006, just 2 years after her parents, and her will left everything to Naomi Carter. But between 2004 and 2008, the property went through a series of rapid transfers involving shell companies, forged probate documents, and fraudulent claims of abandonment. He pulled out a chart showing the chain of ownership. Vera's eyes couldn't quite focus on all the corporate names and dates, but the red lines marking questionable transfers were abundantly clear. Someone wanted this property badly enough to commit systematic fraud to get it, Melissa added, and they used shell companies to obscure the paper trail. Unfortunately, you're now the end point of that fraudulent chain. So what are our options? Vera demanded. The three lawyers exchanged glances. David spoke first. Option 1. You fight this in court. It will be expensive, time-consuming, and given Judge Carter's credentials and the strength of her documentation, you'll likely lose. Option 2. You negotiate a settlement. Maybe you sell the property back to her at current market value, which at least lets you recoup your investment and the money you've put into renovations. Current market value is what? $18 million? Gerald said. We paid 12. We've put at least $3 million into improvements. Where's our profit? Where's our compensation for 8 years of believing we owned this place? Gone, James said bluntly. When you purchase property that was obtained through fraud, you don't get to profit from it. You get to try to recover your losses, if you're lucky. Vera stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, Southampton gleamed in the late morning sun. Beautiful homes, manicured lawns, the casual elegance of extreme wealth. She and Gerald had worked their entire lives to become part of this world. The estate wasn't just a house. It was their entry into the highest social circles, their legacy, the thing that proved they'd truly made it. What if we do nothing? She asked. What if we just refuse to engage? Then she takes you to federal court, wins a judgment, and you're forced to surrender the property plus damages, Melissa said, and it becomes a public spectacle. Every detail gets aired in court proceedings that anyone can access. Your names, your finances, your son's criminal history. His records are sealed, Vera snapped, in criminal court. But in a civil proceeding where he might be called as a character witness, that seal could be challenged. Melissa's voice was sympathetic but firm. Judge Carter was very strategic in filing this in federal court. She has home field advantage, credibility with other judges, and access to resources most plaintiffs don't have. Gerald's face had gone gray. He looked older suddenly, diminished. So we're just supposed to give up? Hand over everything we've built? What you've built on someone else's stolen land, James corrected quietly. I know that's hard to hear, but legally, morally, that's the reality. Vera turned from the window. I want to meet with her, Face to face. No lawyers, just her and me. David shook his head. That's not advisable. Anything you say could be, I don't care. Vera's voice was steel. She made this personal when she showed up at my son's wedding. She wanted to see the house. She wanted to walk the gardens. Fine. She can come back. But this time, we talk. The lawyers tried to dissuade her for another 20 minutes, but Vera was adamant. Finally, David agreed to reach out to Naomi's attorney and propose a meeting. But Vera, he cautioned as they prepared to leave, don't make promises you can't keep. Don't admit to anything. And for God's sake, don't lose your temper. Judge Carter is a professional negotiator. She spent decades in courtrooms. You're playing on her field. Then it's time I learned the game, Vera said. The call came that evening. Naomi Carter would meet with Vera the following afternoon at 3 o'clock. At the estate. The property that both women now claimed as their own. Vera spent the next 24 hours preparing like she was going into battle. She had the house cleaned again, though it was already spotless. She dressed carefully in a cream-colored suit that managed to look both expensive and understated. She rehearsed what she would say, imagining different scenarios and how she would respond. Gerald wanted to be there, but Vera refused. This is between her and me, she said. You'll just make it worse. At 2:50, Vera stood in the main drawing room, watching through the tall windows as a modest sedan came up the driveway. Naomi Carter emerged wearing a simple black suit and carrying the same leather briefcase from the wedding. She looked composed, professional, utterly unflappable. Vera met her at the door herself, dismissing the housekeeper who'd moved to answer. Judge Carter, thank you for coming. Mrs. Bradford. Naomi's tone was neutral, neither warm nor cold. Vera led her to the drawing room where she'd arranged for tea service on the antique table near the fireplace. It was a calculated choice. This room, with its high ceilings and crown molding and the portrait of Vera's grandmother over the mantel, was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of old family lineage and established wealth. If Naomi was impressed or intimidated, she didn't show it. She sat in the offered chair and accepted a cup of tea, her eyes moving around the room with that same careful attention Vera had noticed at the wedding. She was cataloging again, Vera realized, remembering or perhaps comparing what was to what used to be. This was my grandmother's music room, Naomi said quietly. The piano used to sit right there, where your sofa is now. She'd play for hours, Chopin, Debussy, sometimes jazz. The acoustics in here are remarkable. Vera felt a flutter of irritation, but kept her voice even. I asked you here because I want to understand what you're really after. Naomi set down her teacup. I told you at the wedding, I want to restore my family's rightful ownership of this property. Why? Why now, after all these years? Why not pursue this through quiet legal channels instead of ambushing my son's wedding? I didn't ambush anything. I came to see the property. I didn't know there was a wedding until I arrived. You could have left. I did leave. Then I came back. Naomi's gaze was steady. And if I'm being honest, Mrs. Bradford, after the way you treated me, having security escort me out like I was some kind of criminal, refusing to even listen when I tried to explain, I felt less inclined to be accommodating. Vera's jaw tightened. You were a stranger at a private event. I was the rightful owner of the property being used for that private event. Rightful owner? You haven't proven that yet. I will. The documentation is ironclad. Naomi leaned forward slightly. But that's not really what you want to talk about, is it? You want to know if there's a way out of this that doesn't involve you losing everything. The bluntness of it caught Vera off guard. Is there? Naomi was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. That depends on what you mean by everything. If you mean the property itself, no. This estate belongs to my family, and I'm going to take it back. That's not negotiable. Even though we've invested millions into it? Even though, Naomi's voice was firm but not unkind, you invested money into property that was never legitimately yours to begin with. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the underlying fraud. We didn't commit fraud. No, you didn't, but you benefited from it. There's a difference between legal culpability and moral responsibility. Vera stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. This is my home. My husband and I have built our life here. We've hosted charities, employed dozens of local people, contributed to the community. Doesn't that count for something? It does, Naomi said, and there was genuine acknowledgement in her voice. But my grandparents did all of those things too for 43 years. They were pillars of this community. They opened this house for fundraisers and holiday parties and neighborhood gatherings. They employed people like Mrs. Chen and Marcus, gave them stability and opportunity, and then they died, and someone saw a chance to steal everything they'd built. She stood as well, moving to where Vera stood by the fireplace. You asked why now? I'll tell you. For 6 years after my grandparents died, I was drowning in my own life. I was a federal prosecutor working 100-hour weeks on cases that were literally life and death. My marriage fell apart. My mother died, and I barely had time to grieve because I was in the middle of a trial. By the time I came up for air, this house was gone, sold through channels I didn't even know existed. Her voice remained controlled, but emotion flickered beneath the surface. It took me 3 more years just to unravel what had happened, to find the documents, trace the shell companies, identify the people involved in the fraud. And yes, I could have approached you quietly through lawyers, but I wanted to see it first. I wanted to stand in my grandmother's garden one more time before it became a battleground. And instead, you turned my son's wedding into a circus. Your son's wedding became complicated because of the choices other people made years ago, Naomi said. I'm sorry it happened that way, truly. But I won't apologize for claiming what's rightfully mine. Vera turned to face her fully. What if I refuse to leave? What if we fight you in court for years? You said yourself you're willing to go to trial. Then we go to trial. And I win. And you lose not just the property, but potentially millions in damages and court costs. Naomi's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. I have the federal court system on my side, unlimited access to legal resources through my connections, and a case that's already been vetted by 3 independent property law experts. You have an expensive lawyer who specializes in real estate transactions, not complex fraud litigation. She moved closer, her voice dropping. But here's what I'm willing to offer, Mrs. Bradford. A settlement that acknowledges you were unknowing victims of the original fraud. You sell the property back to me at your original purchase price, $12 million. I won't pursue damages for rental value or improvements. You walk away whole, financially speaking. The only thing you lose is the property itself and whatever social capital you've built around owning it. Vera felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. This is our legacy. Or, this is what we're leaving to our son. Your son, Naomi said quietly, already has more than my family ever got to keep. He had the privilege of making mistakes and getting second chances. He had the resources to hire good lawyers when he faced federal charges. He had a mother who could afford to throw him a wedding at an estate worth $20 million. She paused, her gaze steady and penetrating. My family had this house, and someone took it through fraud. Your family has wealth, education, opportunity. You'll recover from this. We're only now getting the chance to recover from what was stolen from us. The words landed like physical blows. Vera wanted to argue, to rage, to throw this woman out of her house again. But something in Naomi's quiet certainty, in the weight of history and documentation she carried, made Vera feel like she was standing on sand that was slowly washing away beneath her feet. I need time, Vera said finally, to talk to my husband, to talk to our lawyers. Take a week, Naomi said. She pulled a business card from her briefcase and set it on the mantel. After that, if I don't hear from you, I proceed with the full legal action, including claims for damages. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Mrs. Bradford, I do understand what you're losing, not the money that you'll recover, but the sense of place, of belonging somewhere. I lost that when I lost this house. It's taken me years to accept that I might never get it back. Not really. The house will be the same, but the memories, the feeling of it being home, that's gone. Then why take it back at all? Vera asked, her voice breaking slightly. Naomi turned, and for the first time, Vera saw real vulnerability in her expression. Because it's all I have left of them. My grandparents poured their lives into this place. Every garden they planted, every room they restored, every person they helped. It's all part of their legacy. And someone tried to erase that legacy for profit. I can't let that stand. Even if the house never feels like home again, I have to restore what was stolen." She walked to the door, then looked back one final time. 7 days, Mrs. Bradford. Think carefully about how you want this to end." After Naomi left, Vera stood alone in the drawing room, the music room, she corrected herself bitterly, and tried to imagine playing the piano where her sofa now sat. Tried to picture a different family laughing in these spaces, loving this house in ways that predated everything she'd built here. The portrait of her grandmother stared down at her with painted eyes that suddenly seemed accusatory. "Your legacy is built on someone else's stolen foundation," those eyes seemed to say. "What does that make it worth?" Vera poured herself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, her hands shaking slightly. Through the window, she could see the garden stretching toward the oak tree where dozens of wedding guests had posed for photos just 2 days ago. The tree with initials carved into it that weren't hers, weren't Gerald's, weren't Evan's. J.W. loves S.W. 1959. James Washington and Sarah Washington, who'd bought this property and built a life here, and apparently made it mean something to the community in ways Vera never had. She'd hosted charity galas, yes, but always with an eye toward social advancement, toward being seen with the right people. Had the Washingtons done it differently? Had they opened these doors out of genuine generosity rather than calculated networking? Vera pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. What mattered was survival, protecting her family, salvaging something from this disaster. She pulled out her phone and called David Hutchins. She offered a settlement, Vera said when he answered. "Original purchase price. No damages. We have 7 days." There was a long pause. "That's actually generous," David said carefully. "Given the strength of her case, she could demand much more. Or we could fight and win." "Vera." David's voice was gentle. "You're not going to win. I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing everything with Melissa and James. Judge Carter's documentation is overwhelming. The original chain of title was fraudulent. Your purchase was made in good faith, but that doesn't override the fundamental invalidity of your claim. So you're giving up?" "I'm being realistic. If you fight this, you'll spend millions in legal fees, lose anyway, and potentially face punitive damages on top of it. Her settlement offer is the best outcome you're going to get." Vera ended the call and sank into the chair Naomi had occupied just minutes before. She closed her eyes and let the tears come finally, hot and bitter and angry. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, gone. Not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because of sins committed by people she'd never met. Fraud perpetrated before she'd even known this property existed. It wasn't fair. But as she sat there crying in a house that suddenly felt haunted by ghosts she'd never acknowledged, Vera was beginning to understand that fairness had nothing to do with it. Naomi Carter wasn't interested in what was fair to Vera. She was interested in what was right. And those were not the same thing at all. Gerald found her there an hour later, still sitting in the chair with mascara streaked down her cheeks and an empty glass in her hand. He'd come home early from his meeting, alerted by something in her voice when she'd called to tell him about Naomi's visit. "Darling," he said softly, kneeling beside the chair. "Tell me everything." So she did. Every word of the conversation, every detail of Naomi's offer, every cold calculation behind what Vera now understood was actually mercy disguised as negotiation. When she finished, Gerald's face had gone through several shades of red before settling on an alarming purple. 12 million, he said, his voice barely controlled. "She wants us to sell her our own property for what we paid 8 years ago, knowing damn well it's worth 20 million now, and she calls that generous." "David says it is? He says we're lucky she's not demanding rental damages on top of everything else." "David's a coward." Gerald stood abruptly, pacing the same path Vera had worn earlier. "We fight this. We find lawyers with spines. We drag this out until she's so exhausted and broke from legal fees that she gives up. She's a federal judge, Gerald. She has resources we can't match. And she's not doing this for money. She's doing it for principle. Those are the most dangerous opponents. Then we make it personal for her too. We dig into her past, find something we can use. Everyone has secrets." Vera looked at her husband with something close to pity. "She presided over Evan's case. She already knows our biggest secret. What could we possibly find that would match that leverage?" Gerald's bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. He sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. So we just surrender? Give up everything we've worked for? We give up the house, Vera said slowly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. We keep our dignity, our finances, our son's sealed record. We take the $12 million and we buy something else. Something without ghosts. This is our home. No. Vera's voice was hollow. It was never really ours. We just didn't know it. The next 3 days were among the worst of Vera's life. She and Gerald told Evan about the settlement offer, watching their son's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally resignation. Chloe, still reeling from the revelation about Evan's criminal past, had gone to stay with her parents in Connecticut, and nobody knew if she was coming back. I'm sorry, Evan said quietly when they finished explaining. If I hadn't gotten into trouble 6 years ago, if Judge Carter hadn't been the one to sentence me, maybe this would all be different. Don't, Vera said sharply. This isn't your fault. This is about fraud that happened before any of us knew this place existed. But privately, she wondered, would Naomi have been less ruthless if Evan's case hadn't created that strange connection between their families? Or would she have pursued this just as aggressively regardless? On the 4th day, Vera did something she'd been avoiding. She went to talk to the staff. She found Mrs. Chen in the kitchen, preparing lunch. The older woman looked up when Vera entered, her expression wary. Mrs. Chen, Vera said, feeling awkward in her own kitchen. Can we talk? Mrs. Chen set down her knife carefully. Of course, Mrs. Bradford. How long did you work for the Washingtons? The question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears and she looked down at her hands. 15 years. From the time I came to this country until they died. Tell me about them. Mrs. Bradford, I don't think... Please. Vera sat down at the kitchen table, something she'd never done in 8 years of living here. I need to understand what we're taking away from Judge Carter, or what we took away without knowing. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat across from Vera, her hands folded on the table. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, they were good people, she began, her accent thickening with emotion. When I came from Taiwan, I spoke almost no English. I was desperate for work. Mrs. Washington, she hired me anyway. She said everyone deserves a chance. She helped me learn English, helped me study for my citizenship test. When my husband got sick, they paid his medical bills. $20,000 they gave us, just like that, because they said no one should have to choose between health and bankruptcy. Vera felt something twist in her chest. They sound remarkable. They were. This house, it wasn't just theirs. They shared it. Every Christmas, they hosted a party for all the staff and their families. Every summer, they opened the gardens for the community. Kids from the neighborhood, they could come play here. Mr. Washington, he taught them about plants, about taking care of things. Mrs. Washington gave piano lessons to any child who wanted to learn, didn't matter if they could pay or not. Mrs. Chen wiped her eyes. When they died, I thought my heart would break. Then the house was sold so fast, before anyone could even grieve properly. I tried to find out what happened to Miss Naomi, to Miss Margaret, but lawyers told me to mind my own business. I needed the work, so I stayed when new owners came. Then you came. And I kept working because I have bills to pay, but every day I walk these halls, I see ghosts. Why didn't you tell us? Vera asked. About the Washingtons, about the family that owned this before. Would it have mattered? Mrs. Chen met her eyes. You bought the house legally, far as you knew. What good would it do to tell you about the people who lost it? Would you have given it back? Vera had no answer for that. She found Marcus next, in the garden shed where he was organizing tools. He straightened when he saw her, that same wary expression everyone seemed to wear around her now. Mrs. Bradford. Marcus, I want to apologize. For the wedding. For having you escort Judge Carter out when you clearly knew who she was. Marcus set down the rake he'd been holding. You didn't know, ma'am. How could you? But you did know, and I put you in an impossible position. I was 16 when the Washingtons died, Marcus said. Miss Naomi was already in law school, becoming someone important. But the summer she was here, she was kind to all of us. She remembered our names, asked about our lives. Mrs. Washington, she was the one who encouraged me to become a police officer. She said the world needed good men protecting people. He looked toward the house, his expression distant. When I heard the property had been sold, I tried to find out what happened. Nobody would tell me anything. The lawyers said the family had given it up, that everything was handled properly. But it didn't feel right, you know? The Washingtons loved this place. They wouldn't have just abandoned it. Did you ever try to contact Naomi? I didn't know how. She was federal prosecutor by then, probably moving in circles way above people like me. I figured if something was wrong, someone with her resources would fix it. He met Vera's eyes. Guess she finally did. Vera spent that evening with Gerald in his study, surrounded by the financial documents their lawyers had prepared. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. $12 million from the sale to Naomi, $3 million to pay off the remaining mortgage, another $2 million to cover the renovations they'd financed, $7 million left, split between them after taxes and legal fees. We could buy something nice with $7 million, Gerald said, but his voice held no conviction. Maybe a place in Greenwich, smaller, but still respectable. We'd be starting over, Vera said, at our age. We've started over before. Had they? Vera tried to remember the trajectory of their lives before the estate. Gerald's career in finance, her work in interior design, the steady accumulation of wealth and status that had eventually led them here. It had all felt like forward momentum, like they were building towards something permanent. Now she understood that nothing was permanent. Everything could be revealed as built on sand, on someone else's stolen foundation. On the 6th day, Vera received an unexpected visitor. She answered the door herself to find a tall black man in his 60s, wearing a well-cut suit and carrying a worn briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of use. Mrs. Bradford, I'm Thomas Carter, Naomi's uncle. Vera's first instinct was to close the door. Her second was curiosity. She chose the latter, stepping back to let him enter. She led him to the same drawing room where she'd met with Naomi, but this time the space felt different. Haunted by the conversation about the piano that used to sit where her sofa was, about the music room this used to be. I'm not here on behalf of my niece, Thomas said once they were seated. She doesn't know I'm here, actually. I came because I wanted you to understand something that maybe she won't tell you directly. And what's that? Thomas looked around the room with the same careful attention Naomi had shown. This house nearly destroyed our family. Not losing it, but the way we lost it. My sister Margaret, Naomi's mother, she spent her last years trying to figure out what happened to her parents' estate. She hired lawyers, filed complaints, tried to trace where the property had gone. It consumed her. The stress, the frustration of running into dead ends, I think it contributed to the cancer that killed her. His voice was heavy with old grief. Naomi watched her mother waste away while fighting a battle she couldn't win. Then Margaret died, and Naomi had to take up the fight while also trying to build a career, save a failing marriage, and deal with her own grief. This property, Mrs. Bradford, has taken everything from my family, and Naomi's trying to get back the one thing she can actually recover, the land itself. She can't get back the memories, Vera said softly. That's what she told me. No, she can't. My parents are gone. My sister's gone. The summers we spent here, the holidays, all the moments that made this place home, those are lost forever. But maybe if Naomi can stand in the garden where her grandmother taught her about roses, maybe if she can play piano in the room where her grandmother gave lessons, maybe that's enough to heal some of the wound. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. I'm not asking you to give up the house out of pity. I'm asking you to understand that your loss, painful as it is different from ours. You're losing a house you bought 8 years ago. We lost a legacy that took generations to build. You'll recover financially. We're trying to recover something that can't be measured in dollars. Your niece made it clear she'll take this to court if we don't settle, Vera said, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. She will, because she can't let this stand. Not after watching her mother die trying to fix it. Not after spending years of her own life unraveling the fraud. If she walks away now, it means everything they suffered was for nothing. Thomas stood. I just wanted you to hear it from someone who loves her, who watched her struggle with this decision. She's not trying to punish you, Mrs. Bradford. She's trying to restore what was stolen before it destroys what's left of our family. After he left, Vera sat alone with his words echoing in her mind. She thought about her own family, about Evan's struggles and Chloe's uncertainty and Gerald's deflated pride. She thought about what it would do to them to fight this battle for years, to have their finances and their son's past dragged through public court proceedings, to watch legal fees mount while their chances of winning diminished. And she thought about Naomi Carter, who'd stood in this room and admitted the house might never feel like home again, but was willing to fight for it anyway because it was all she had left of the people she'd loved. On the morning of the 7th day, Vera called David Hutchins. "Accept the settlement," she said. "Draw up whatever papers need to be signed. We'll sell to Judge Carter at the original purchase price." "Vera, are you sure we still have options to all—" "I'm sure. Get it done." Gerald took the news with quiet resignation. Evan called from Connecticut, his voice thick with emotion, and told her he was proud of her for making the difficult choice. Chloe had agreed to come back, he said, to give their marriage another chance. At least something good would come from this disaster. The closing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Vera spent those weeks packing up 8 years of accumulated life, sorting through possessions and deciding what to keep and what to discard. Every item felt heavy with the weight of lost dreams. 2 days before the closing, Vera was in the music room boxing up books when Naomi appeared in the doorway. Vera hadn't heard her arrive, hadn't heard the doorbell, but there she was, as if summoned by Vera's thoughts. "Mrs. Chen let me in," Naomi said. "I hope that's all right." Vera set down the book she'd been holding. "I suppose it's your house now, or will be soon." Naomi stepped into the room, her eyes moving to the exact spot where she'd said the piano used to sit. "I wanted to thank you for accepting the settlement. I know it wasn't easy." "Easy?" Vera laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "No, it wasn't easy. It was one of the hardest decisions of my life." "I know." Naomi's voice was gentle. "And I want you to know that I recognize the sacrifice you're making. You didn't commit the original fraud. You were victims of it too, in your own way." "Then why take it out on us?" "I'm not taking anything out on you. I'm restoring what should never have been taken in the first place." Naomi moved closer. "If I could go back and undo the fraud before it ever touched your lives, I would. But I can't. All I can do is correct it now." Vera felt tears threaten again and blinked them back. "Your uncle came to see me. He told me about your mother." Naomi's composure cracked slightly. "He shouldn't have done that." "I'm glad he did. It helped me understand why you couldn't let this go." Vera gestured at the empty room, the packed boxes. "This place meant something to your family. I'm sorry we couldn't have had it under different circumstances. Maybe as friends or neighbors. Instead, we're just two families whose lives got tangled up in someone else's crime." "Maybe that's not all we have to be," Naomi said quietly. She pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to Vera. "This is a personal check, separate from the settlement. It's for $100,000. Vera stared at the check. "I don't understand." "When I take possession of this property, I'm going to need staff. Mrs. Chen has already agreed to stay on as head of household management. Marcus is considering coming back as property manager. I want to hire other people who were displaced when the original fraud occurred, people who lost their jobs when my grandparents died." Naomi paused. "Some of those people were trained by you over the past 8 years. They're good at what they do because you taught them. I want to offer retention bonuses to encourage them to stay. This check is to compensate you for the training you provided to staff that I'll be inheriting." "That's not necessary." "It's fair. You're losing the property, but that doesn't mean the work you did here has no value. The people you employed, the systems you established, those have value. I want to acknowledge that." Vera looked at the check, then at Naomi. This woman who had every reason to despise her, who could have crushed her in court and demanded millions in damages, who was being merciful in ways Vera was only beginning to understand. "I hated you," Vera said suddenly. "When you showed up at Evan's wedding, when you came back with your briefcase and your legal documents, I hated you with everything I had." "I know. I thought you were stealing from us. I thought you were the villain in our story." "You weren't entirely wrong," Naomi said. "From your perspective, I am taking your home. That's a real loss, and I'm not dismissing it. But from your perspective, you're recovering something stolen from you." Yes. Vera folded the check carefully and set it on the mantel beside the business card Naomi had left there weeks ago. Can I ask you something? When you get this place back, when you finally have the deed in your name and the legal battles are over, what then? What are you going to do with a house this size? Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where the late autumn sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. I'm going to open it up, she said finally, the way my grandparents did. I'm going to offer summer music programs for kids who can't afford lessons. I'm going to host community events, scholarship fundraisers, gatherings for people who need a beautiful space but can't access one otherwise. I'm going to make this house do what it was always meant to do, serve something larger than just one family's comfort. She turned back to Vera. My grandparents believed that wealth came with responsibility, that if you were lucky enough to own something this beautiful, you had an obligation to share it. I want to honor that legacy. I want this place to mean something again beyond just being an impressive address. Vera felt something shift in her chest. Maybe it was acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion from fighting against the inevitable. They would be proud of you, your grandparents. I hope so. Naomi's voice was thick with emotion. I've spent so many years being angry, being driven by the need to correct this wrong. I forgot sometimes what they actually stood for. It wasn't about the property itself. It was about what the property represented: community, generosity, the idea that we're all connected. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mrs. Bradford, when you find your next home, wherever that is, I hope you'll build something you can be proud of. Something that reflects your values, not just your wealth. Because I think underneath all of this, underneath the anger and the hurt, you're a better person than this situation has allowed you to be. After Naomi left, Vera stood alone in the empty music room and cried. But this time, the tears felt different. Not just grief for what she was losing, but something else. Relief, maybe, or release. The burden of fighting to keep something that was never really hers to begin with had been crushing her, and she hadn't even realized it until the weight lifted. Gerald found her there as the sun was setting, painting the room in long shadows. We're going to be okay, he said, pulling her close. We'll find another house, we'll rebuild. I know, Vera said, and for the first time in weeks, she actually believed it. The closing took place in David Hutchins' conference room on a gray November morning. Papers were signed, checks were transferred, keys were handed over. The whole process took less than 2 hours. 8 years of believing they owned something, dissolved in the time it took to sign their names a dozen times. As they walked out of the building, Vera felt Gerald's hand in hers, solid and warm. She looked back once at the building where they'd just signed away their home, then forward at the street ahead where morning traffic moved in purposeful streams. Somewhere behind her, Naomi Carter was taking possession of her family's legacy. Somewhere ahead, Vera and Gerald Bradford were starting over. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like the only right ending this story could have had all along. 3 days after the closing, Vera stood in the empty Greenwich townhouse they'd purchased with part of the settlement money and felt the full weight of what starting over actually meant. The place was smaller than the estate by half, with narrow rooms and low ceilings that made her feel claustrophobic after years of soaring Georgian architecture. Gerald was trying to sound optimistic as he measured spaces for furniture, but she could hear the forced cheerfulness in his voice. The location is excellent, he said for the third time that morning. Walking distance to town, good restaurants nearby. Very convenient. It's fine, Gerald, Vera said, though the word felt like sawdust in her mouth. Fine. Everything about their new life was fine, acceptable, adequate. Nothing was exceptional anymore. Her phone rang, jarring her from the spiral of self-pity. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway, grateful for the distraction. Mrs. Bradford, this is Melissa Park from David Hutchins' office. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. No, it's fine. What can I do for you? I'm calling because something unusual has come up regarding the estate sale. Judge Carter has requested a meeting with you and Mr. Bradford at the property, tomorrow at 2 o'clock if you're available. Vera felt her stomach drop. A meeting? Why? The sale is final. Everything's been signed. I don't have details. Her attorney simply said she has something she'd like to discuss with you both. It's not legally required, so you're free to decline, but she specifically requested that you consider coming. After Melissa hung up, Vera stood staring at her phone. Gerald looked up from his measuring tape, concerned. What is it? Naomi Carter wants to meet with us. Tomorrow. At the estate. What? Why? I don't know. Vera's mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had Naomi found some new issue with the sale? Was she going to demand more money? Had she discovered some damage to the property that Vera would somehow be held responsible for? We don't have to go, Gerald said. We're done with that place. Whatever she wants, she can communicate through lawyers. But even as he said it, Vera knew they would go. Curiosity, if nothing else, would drive them back to the house they'd spent weeks trying to forget. The next afternoon, they drove out to the Hamptons in tense silence. As they turned onto Ocean Road and the estate came into view, Vera felt her chest constrict. The property looked different already, though she couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Then she realized the security gate was open, propped wide in a way they'd never left it, an invitation rather than a barrier. Naomi met them at the front door herself, wearing jeans and a cable-knit sweater that made her look younger, less intimidating than in her usual suits. Mr. and Mrs. Bradford, thank you for coming. I know this must be strange. That's one word for it, Gerald said stiffly. Naomi led them inside, and Vera had to physically restrain herself from commenting on the changes she immediately noticed. The formal furniture in the entry hall had been replaced with simpler pieces. The heavy drapes were gone, letting in floods of natural light. Family photographs lined the walls. Black faces from different eras, candid shots that spoke of love and laughter rather than the formal portraits Vera had chosen. They walked to the drawing room. No, the music room, Vera corrected herself, and found it transformed. A beautiful grand piano now sat exactly where Naomi had said her grandmother's instrument used to be. The acoustics in the space immediately made sense in a way they never had before. But it wasn't just Naomi waiting for them. Mrs. Chen was there, and Marcus and several other staff members Vera recognized. And seated in chairs arranged in a loose semicircle were a dozen people Vera had never seen before, older black men and women, some looking uncomfortable in the formal setting, others gazing around the room with expressions of wonder and grief. I'm sorry for the ambush, Naomi said, but I wanted you to meet some people. These are the workers who were employed by my grandparents, the ones who lost their jobs when the property was fraudulently sold, who never got proper notice or severance, who were just told one day that their services were no longer needed. An older woman with silver hair and kind eyes stood up slowly, leaning on a cane. I'm Dorothy Williams. I was Sarah Washington's personal assistant for 18 years. When she died and the house was sold, I was 61 years old. Nobody would hire someone my age for comparable work. I ended up cleaning offices at night just to make rent. A man in his 70s raised his hand slightly. Robert Chen, Helen's husband. I was the groundskeeper. Mr. Washington and we spent 15 years turning those gardens into something special. After the sale, I tried to find out what happened, if I could at least get my tools back. Some of them were my own that I'd brought from home. Never got an answer. Never got my last 2 weeks of pay either. One by one, they told their stories. A cook who'd had to move in with her daughter after losing her job and her apartment. A driver who'd worked for the Washingtons since he was 19, let go at 53 with nothing. A tutor who'd helped Naomi with her homework during summer visits, suddenly unemployed and scrambling to find new clients. Vera felt each story like a physical blow. She'd known intellectually that the fraud had consequences beyond just property ownership, but hearing these people describe the cascading effects of their sudden unemployment made it horrifyingly real. I don't understand, Gerald said, his voice rough. Why are you telling us this? We didn't fire these people. We weren't even involved when they lost their jobs. I know, Naomi said, but you asked me at the closing what I was going to do with this property. This is part of it. I'm not just restoring ownership. I'm trying to restore what the fraud destroyed. These people lost more than jobs. They lost stability, dignity, retirement plans. Some of them lost their homes as a result. The ripple effects of what happened here damaged dozens of lives. She moved to stand beside the piano. When I was building my case to reclaim this property, I had to track down everyone who'd been affected by the fraud, not just for legal purposes, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what was stolen. It wasn't just land and a house. It was livelihoods, community connections, the social fabric my grandparents had built over 4 decades. Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice stronger than Vera had ever heard it. When Mrs. Bradford hired me 8 years ago, I almost said no. Working in this house after the Washingtons were gone, after everything that happened, it felt like betraying their memory. But I needed the work. I have always needed the work. I'm sorry, Vera said, the words feeling inadequate. I had no idea. When we bought this place, we were told it came from a development company. We never thought to ask about the people who worked here before. Most buyers don't, Naomi said, not unkindly. But that's part of the problem. Property changes hands, and we act like buildings and land exist in a vacuum. We forget about the human beings whose lives are connected to those spaces. Dorothy Williams stood again, moving slowly to the window that overlooked the gardens. Sarah Washington used to stand right here every morning with her coffee. She'd look out at the roses and plan her day. She paid me a good salary, yes, but more than that, she made me feel valued. When my grandson needed help with college applications, she spent hours working with him. When my husband died, she gave me 3 weeks off with full pay. You can't put a dollar amount on that kind of respect. And that's why I asked you here, Naomi said, turning back to Vera and Gerald. Not to make you feel guilty, though I understand that may be an unavoidable side effect. I asked you here because I'm creating a restoration fund, money set aside specifically to compensate the people who were harmed by the original fraud. She pulled out a folder and opened it on the piano. I've calculated back wages, lost retirement contributions, and general damages for everyone who was employed here when my grandparents died. It comes to approximately $400,000 across 15 people. Gerald's eyes widened. That's very generous of you. It's the minimum of what's owed, Naomi corrected, but I can't do it alone. The settlement money I paid you, $12 million, that cleared out most of my liquid assets. I have the property now, but not enough cash to fully fund the restoration I want to do. She paused, her gaze moving between Vera and Gerald. So I'm asking if you'd consider contributing to the fund. Not because you're legally obligated, you're not, but because you have the resources, and these people have been waiting for justice for 16 years. The request hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Vera felt Gerald stiffen beside her, his jaw clenching in the way it did when he was about to say something he knew she wouldn't like. You're asking us to pay for crimes we didn't commit, Gerald said carefully, to compensate people we never harmed, for a situation we had no part in creating. I'm asking you to do the right thing, Naomi said simply. The right thing, Gerald repeated, his voice rising. We just lost our home. We took a massive financial hit because of your claim on this property. We've been humiliated, displaced, forced to start over. And now you want us to hand over more money? I want you to help correct an injustice. An injustice that existed long before we arrived. Gerald was on his feet now. We were victims too, Naomi. Maybe not to the same degree, but victims nonetheless. We bought this property in good faith. We invested millions in improvements. We employed these same people and paid them fairly. We don't owe anyone anything more. Gerald. Vera's voice was quiet, but it cut through his anger. She was looking at Mrs. Chen, at the way the older woman's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. At Marcus, standing near the door with his security guard posture but his eyes full of hope. At Dorothy Williams by the window, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned not to expect much from people with money. What are you thinking? Gerald asked his wife warily. I'm thinking about what your grandmother said, Vera said to Naomi, about wealth coming with responsibility. Vera, no. Gerald's voice was low and urgent. We've given enough. More than enough. Have we? Vera stood, moving to where Dorothy stood by the window. Mrs. Williams, how much did you lose when you were let go without notice? Dorothy looked surprised by the direct question. In immediate wages? Maybe $5,000. But in the long term, with the jobs I couldn't get at my age, the retirement I couldn't build, probably closer to $200,000 over the next decade. And you, Mr. Chen? Robert Chen straightened slightly. Similar. Maybe $3,000 in unpaid wages, but I'd been working toward buying a small house. Without steady income, I lost that opportunity. My wife and we rented for 15 more years when we could have owned. Vera turned back to Naomi. How much are you asking from us? Vera, Gerald said again, more forcefully. How much? She repeated. Naomi met her eyes. $100,000, split between the 15 people who lost employment. It's not full compensation, but combined with what I can contribute, it would allow everyone to receive at least partial restitution. That's ridiculous, Gerald said. $100,000 on top of everything we've already lost? Absolutely not. But Vera was thinking about the check Naomi had given her, the one for staff retention bonuses. $100,000, given freely because Naomi believed in acknowledging value even when legally unnecessary. She was thinking about Thomas Carter's visit, his words about losses that couldn't be measured in dollars. She was thinking about what kind of person she wanted to be when this was all over. Someone who fought to keep every penny out of principle, or someone who could recognize that some fights weren't worth winning. I'll contribute $50,000, Vera said, from my personal accounts, not our joint funds. It's the same amount Naomi gave me for staff retention. It feels appropriate to give it back in this way. Vera, have you lost your mind? Gerald's face was red. That's your money. Money you earned from your design work. Money you saved. Money that means less to me than my integrity, Vera said firmly. I didn't cause this situation, Gerald. Neither did you. But we did benefit from it, whether we knew it or not. These people suffered real losses because of the same fraud that gave us 8 years in a beautiful home. If I can ease some of that suffering, why wouldn't I? She turned to Naomi. I can write a check today. $50,000 to your restoration fund. It's not the full amount you asked for, but it's what I can do without financially devastating ourselves. Naomi's expression was unreadable. That's incredibly generous, Mrs. Bradford. It's not generous, Vera corrected. It's fair. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Dorothy Williams walked over to Vera, moving slowly on her cane, and took Vera's hand in both of hers. Her skin was papery and warm, her grip surprisingly strong. Thank you, Dorothy said simply. Not just for the money, though that helps more than you know. Thank you for seeing us, for understanding that we exist, that what happened to us mattered. Vera felt tears sting her eyes. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. Gerald was still standing by his chair, rigid with anger and confusion. But as he looked around the room at the faces of people who'd been invisible to him just an hour ago, something in his expression began to shift. Slowly, like ice cracking under spring sun, his shoulders lowered. Christ, he muttered, I'm going to regret this. He pulled out his checkbook. I'll match Vera's $50,000, but that's it. That's absolutely all we can afford. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise and gratitude. Several of the former staff members were crying. Mrs. Chen covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Naomi looked genuinely moved. Mr. and Mrs. Bradford, this is more than I expected, more than these folks have had any reason to hope for. Don't make us into heroes, Gerald said gruffly, writing out the check with quick, angry strokes. We're just trying to do the least terrible thing in a terrible situation. Sometimes that's all heroism is, Naomi said quietly. As Gerald handed over the check, Marcus spoke up from his position by the door. Judge Carter, if it's all right, I'd like to say something. Naomi nodded. Marcus moved forward, addressing Vera and Gerald directly. When you hired me 8 years ago as security, I almost turned down the job. Working here again after the Washingtons, it felt wrong, but I needed the income. You paid me fairly, treated me with respect, gave me opportunities to advance. That meant something, even if the foundation was complicated. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I don't know if what you're doing today erases anything. Maybe nothing can erase what happened, but it means something that you're trying, that you're willing to see past your own loss to acknowledge others. That's worth something. Vera felt a lump in her throat. Thank you, Marcus. Naomi cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention back to her. There's one more thing I want to discuss while everyone's here. Mrs. Bradford, you asked me what I plan to do with this property. I've spent the last few weeks developing a more concrete plan, and I wanted to share it with you because some of it was inspired by our conversations. She moved to the piano and pulled out a different folder, this one filled with architectural drawings and budget spreadsheets. I'm establishing the Washington Family Foundation, named for my grandparents. The foundation will use this property as its headquarters and primary programming space. We'll offer year-round music education for underprivileged kids, summer internship programs in hospitality and property management, and quarterly community events open to the public. She spread the papers across the piano's surface. I'm also creating a legacy fund that will provide college scholarships for descendants of everyone who worked here during my grandparents' tenure. That includes children and grandchildren of the people in this room, but also the staff who worked here during the Bradford years. Vera's head snapped up. What? Your staff members are part of this property's history too, Naomi said. They maintained it, cared for it, served the community through their work here. Their children deserve opportunities just as much as anyone else's. Mrs. Chen made a small sound. My granddaughter, she wants to study music therapy. But the programs are expensive and she can apply for the scholarship, Naomi said gently. The first awards will go out next fall. Gerald was staring at Naomi like he was seeing her for the first time. Why would you do that? Why would you include our staff in your family's legacy? Because the point isn't revenge, Naomi said. The point is restoration. Not just of property or money, but of the principle my grandparents built this place on. That we all rise together, that service matters, that every person who contributes to a community deserves to be honored. She looked at Vera. You said something at the closing that stuck with me. You said maybe we could have been friends under different circumstances. I've been thinking about that. And I realized that just because our circumstances were difficult doesn't mean we can't choose to be better than the situation that brought us together. Robert Chen spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Washington used to say that gardens grow best when you tend them with love, not anger. Said that applied to everything, plants, communities, relationships. You're tending his garden the way he would have wanted, Miss Naomi. Naomi smiled, but tears were visible in her eyes. I'm trying. Some days I'm still angry about what was stolen. Some days I want to burn everything down and start over. But then I remember that burning things down was never what they were about. They built things. They grew things. They made things better. She turned back to Vera and Gerald. That's why I wanted you here today. Not just to ask for money, though that's part of it, but to show you what I'm building. To invite you to be part of something larger than just a property dispute or a financial transaction. This house is going to mean something again. It's going to serve people who need serving. And everyone who contributes to that mission, including both of you, will be acknowledged. Acknowledged how? Vera asked. Naomi gestured to the wall near the piano. I'm installing a donor wall. Everyone who contributes to the foundation, regardless of amount, will be listed. Your names will be there, along with your contribution and a note about your connection to the property. Future generations will know that you chose to support this mission even after losing your home to it. Gerald laughed, a sound without humor. So we get our names on a wall in exchange for $100,000 and the most painful experience of our lives. What a bargain. You get to be part of something that matters, Naomi said. You get to tell your grandchildren that when you were faced with a choice between bitterness and generosity, you chose generosity. You get to sleep at night knowing you did the right thing, even when it cost you. She moved closer to them, her voice dropping. Mr. and Mrs. Bradford, I know I'm asking a lot. I know you've already given up more than you wanted to, but I'm offering you something in return, a chance to reshape the story of your connection to this place. Right now, your story ends with loss and displacement. Help me build this foundation, and your story becomes about restoration and justice. Which ending do you want? Vera looked at Gerald and saw her own confusion and reluctance reflected in his face. They'd come here expecting accusations or demands, prepared to fight or flee. Instead, they'd been invited to participate in something that acknowledged their pain while also transcending it. I need time to think, Gerald said finally. This is all happening very fast. Of course. Naomi collected her papers. But while you're thinking, I want you to meet one more person. She gestured toward the doorway, where a young woman in her 20s had appeared, carrying a worn violin case. This is Jasmine Williams, Dorothy's granddaughter, the one Sarah Washington gave piano lessons to when she was 7 years old. Jasmine moved into the room with quiet confidence, setting her violin case on a chair and opening it. Judge Carter asked me to play something today. I told her I wasn't sure I could do it without crying, but she said that was okay. She said tears were part of restoration too. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, closed her eyes for a moment, then began to play. The melody was heartbreakingly beautiful, something classical that Vera didn't recognize, but that filled the room with sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The acoustics Naomi had mentioned made every note shimmer and echo, creating layers of harmony that transcended the single instrument. When Jasmine finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Gerald was surreptitiously wiping his face. "Mrs. Washington taught me to hear music in everything," Jasmine said softly. "In rain on windows, in wind through trees, in people's voices when they spoke with passion. She said music was just another word for paying attention to beauty. That's what this house taught me, to pay attention, to hear what others might miss." She looked at Vera and Gerald. "I don't know you. I don't know if you're good people or bad people, but I know you're here, and you're listening, and you're trying to figure out how to be better. Mrs. Washington would say that's enough. That's where all growth starts, with listening and trying." After Jasmine packed up her violin and the former staff members began to leave, murmuring thanks and goodbyes, Vera found herself alone with Naomi in the music room. Gerald had stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving the two women in the space where so much had been lost and was now being rebuilt. "You orchestrated all of this very carefully," Vera said. "It wasn't an accusation, just an observation." "I did," Naomi admitted. "I wanted you to see the human impact of what happened, to meet the people behind the abstractions. Was that manipulative? Probably. But it was effective." Vera moved to the piano, running her hand along its polished surface. "You're building something remarkable here, something your grandparents would be proud of." "I hope so. Some days I'm not sure if I'm honoring them or just trying to heal myself." "Maybe it's both," Vera said. "Maybe that's allowed." They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who'd been adversaries and were now something else, not quite friends, but no longer enemies. Partners, perhaps, in trying to make something broken into something whole. 6 months later, Vera stood in the parking area of the estate, no longer hers, but a place she'd come to accept as part of her history rather than her identity, watching workers install the last pieces of the donor wall near the main entrance. Her name was there, engraved in elegant script alongside Gerald's. Bradford family, Restoration Fund contributors, former stewards of the property, 2016-2024. Former stewards. She'd helped Naomi choose that phrasing during one of their monthly planning meetings. It acknowledged their connection without claiming ownership, recognized their care of the place without erasing the fraud that had brought them there. "It looks good," Gerald said, coming up beside her. He'd softened considerably in the months since that emotional gathering in the music room. The anger that had sustained him through the legal battle had given way to something quieter, more reflective. He'd even joined the foundation's advisory board, using his financial expertise to help structure the endowment that would support the scholarship program. "It does," Vera agreed. She was surprised by how much it meant to see their names there, to know that their story would be told as part of the property's larger narrative. Not as villains or victims, but as people who'd made mistakes and tried to correct them. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the East Garden, where Naomi was leading a tour of the summer music program students. 20 kids between 8 and 16, all carrying instruments, all from families who could never afford private music lessons. They gathered around the fountain while Naomi explained its history, how her grandfather had restored it piece by piece over 2 decades. "That fountain was broken for 40 years before he bought this property," Naomi was saying. "Everyone told him to tear it out, start fresh. But he believed broken things could be made beautiful again if you were patient enough to understand how they'd been broken in the first place." One of the kids, a girl with braids and a clarinet case, raised her hand. "Is that why you fixed this whole place? Because it was broken?" Naomi smiled. "Exactly. This property was broken by fraud and greed. But underneath that brokenness was something beautiful that just needed people to care about it again." Vera felt Gerald's hand find hers, squeezing gently. They'd had versions of this conversation dozens of times in recent months, about what it meant to rebuild, to restore, to make peace with complicated histories. Their marriage had been tested by the loss of the estate, by the financial stress and social embarrassment. But somehow, working with Naomi on the foundation had given them a shared purpose that pulled them back together. "Mrs. Bradford!" a voice called out. Vera turned to see Mrs. Chen hurrying toward them, her face flushed with excitement. "I'm so glad you're here. Judge Carter wanted me to tell you the first round of scholarship applications came in this morning. 47 applicants for 12 slots." 47? Gerald's eyebrows rose. "That's incredible." "My granddaughter applied," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes bright with tears. "For the music therapy program at NYU. She never thought she'd have a chance at something like that. Now she does." Watching Mrs. Chen's joy, Vera felt something unlock in her chest. For months, she'd been carrying guilt about the staff members who'd suffered during the transition, about the ways her ignorance had contributed to injustice even if she hadn't caused it directly. Seeing Mrs. Chen's granddaughter get a real chance at her dreams, that started to balance the scales in ways Vera hadn't thought possible. The tour group moved toward the house, and Naomi caught sight of Vera and Gerald. She said something to her assistant, a young man named Marcus Jr., who'd been hired as the foundation's operations director, then walked over to them. "You came," Naomi said, genuine warmth in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "We wouldn't miss the dedication," Vera said. Today was the official opening of the Washington Family Foundation, 6 months of renovation and planning culminating in a public ceremony that would establish the property's new purpose. "I have something to show you before the ceremony starts," Naomi said. "Something I wanted you to see privately first." She led them into the house, through the entrance hall where the historical photographs now included images from multiple eras, the Washington years, but also candid shots from the Bradford period. Vera had been shocked when Naomi asked for permission to include those photos, to acknowledge that their time here was part of the property's story too. They climbed the main staircase to the second floor, past the music studios that had been constructed in what used to be guest bedrooms. The sound of a violin drifted from one room, a piano from another. The house was alive with music in a way Vera had never achieved during her years of careful decorating and entertaining. Naomi stopped at a door Vera recognized as the master bedroom, her bedroom for 8 years. "I want to show you what we did with this space." She opened the door, and Vera gasped. The room had been transformed into a library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining every wall. But these weren't decorative books chosen for their leather bindings. These were worn paperbacks and dog-eared hardcovers, books that had been read and loved and shared. A reading area in the center featured comfortable chairs and good lighting, a space designed for study and contemplation. "This is the Bradford Washington Resource Library," Naomi said, "open to all Foundation participants and community members. We focused on collecting books about social justice, civil rights, legal history, property law, and restoration. Everything someone would need to understand what happened here and how to prevent it from happening elsewhere." Vera moved closer to the shelves, reading titles. Between the books, small plaques identified donations. Bradford Family Collection, Washington Family Collection, Chen Family Collection. Dozens of families represented, their contributions woven together. "Why name it after both families?" Gerald asked, his voice rough. "Because both families are part of this property's history," Naomi said simply. "The Washingtons built something beautiful. It was stolen through fraud. The Bradfords unknowingly participated in that theft, but then chose to make amends. That whole complicated story deserves to be told, not just the parts that make any of us look good." She pulled a book from the shelf and handed it to Vera. It was a leather-bound journal, clearly new. "This is for you, if you want it. The Foundation is creating an oral history project, collecting stories from everyone who's been connected to this property. I'd like to interview you, record your perspective, not to shame you or expose you, but to document the full complexity of what happened here." Vera opened the journal, saw her name embossed on the first page. Vera Bradford, Steward and Donor, 2016 to 2025. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the first blank page. "What would you want me to say?" "The truth," Naomi said. "What it felt like to buy this place, to love it, to believe it was yours. What it felt like to discover it had been stolen before you ever saw it. What it felt like to lose it and then choose to support its restoration anyway. All of it, the good and the bad, and the complicated. I don't know if I can be that honest, Vera admitted. You don't have to decide today. Just think about it. Your story matters, Mrs. Bradford, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. A knock on the door interrupted them. Marcus Jr. poked his head in. Judge Carter, we're ready to start the ceremony. The mayor's here, and there's a reporter from the Times. The New York Times? Gerald looked startled. They're doing a feature on property restoration and historical justice, Naomi said. This foundation is apparently newsworthy. As they headed downstairs, Vera felt a flutter of anxiety. She and Gerald had agreed to attend the ceremony, but she hadn't anticipated press coverage. What would the reporter ask? How would they explain their role in this story? But when they emerged onto the back lawn where chairs had been set up for 200 guests, Vera realized they were just part of a much larger narrative. The former staff members were there, dressed in their finest clothes. Community members who'd known the Washingtons filled the front rows. Local politicians and business leaders occupied the middle sections. Students from the music program sat together near the back, their instruments resting carefully beside their chairs. Naomi took the small stage that had been erected near the oak tree, the one with the initials carved into it. She wore a navy dress, the same simple style she'd worn the day of Evan's wedding, Vera realized. A deliberate choice, connecting the beginning of this journey to its transformation. Thank you all for being here, Naomi began, her voice carrying across the lawn without need for amplification. Years of courtroom experience had taught her how to project authority and warmth simultaneously. 6 months ago, I stood in this garden for the first time in nearly 20 years. I'd just reclaimed legal ownership of my family's property after a long battle to undo the fraud that had stolen it from us. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled guests. I came here that day angry, hurt, determined to take back what was mine by any means necessary. I thought restoration meant erasing everything that had happened since my grandparents died, returning the property to exactly what it had been. Vera felt her face flush, remembering that day. The humiliation of being escorted out by security. The shock of Naomi's return with her briefcase of documents. The wedding that had become a battlefield. But I was wrong, Naomi continued. True restoration isn't about erasing history. It's about acknowledging all of it, the beauty and the theft, the love and the loss, the mistakes and the corrections. It's about taking broken pieces and making something new that honors what came before while moving toward something better. She gestured toward the house. This property has had many chapters. My grandparents' chapter was about building community and sharing wealth. The fraudulent chapter was about greed and exploitation. The Bradford chapter was complicated. Unknowing participation in theft, but also genuine care for the property and its staff. And now we begin a new chapter, one that tries to weave all these threads into something whole. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Vera saw Dorothy Williams dabbing her eyes. Robert Chen nodding with quiet affirmation. Mrs. Chen holding her granddaughter's hand tightly. The Washington Family Foundation exists because of loss, Naomi said, but it will thrive because of grace. Grace from the people who worked here and were displaced but chose to return. Grace from the community members who supported this vision even when the path forward was unclear. And yes, grace from the Bradford family, who could have fought this battle until everyone involved was bankrupted and bitter, but instead chose to participate in healing. She looked directly at Vera and Gerald. Would you both come up here, please? Vera's heart hammered. Gerald looked equally panicked, but they stood, making their way through the crowd to the small stage. Naomi took Vera's hand as she climbed the steps, steadying her. Mrs. Bradford, Mr. Bradford, I want to publicly acknowledge something I should have said more clearly months ago. When I appeared at your son's wedding, I was so focused on my own grief and anger that I didn't consider how my actions would affect your family. I caused pain at what should have been a joyful occasion. For that, I'm sorry. The apology, unexpected and public, nearly undid Vera completely. She felt tears spill over, hot against her cheeks. You were fighting for justice, Vera managed. You had every right to— I had every right to pursue legal remedies, Naomi corrected gently, but I could have chosen to exercise those rights with more compassion for the innocent people caught in the crossfire. Just because I was legally justified doesn't mean I handled everything perfectly. She turned to address the crowd again. That's one of the core principles of this foundation. The understanding that being right about the big picture doesn't excuse us from being thoughtful about the details. Justice without mercy is just another form of cruelty. Naomi reached behind the podium and pulled out two framed documents. Mr. and Mrs. Bradford, in recognition of your contributions to the Restoration Fund and your ongoing support of the Foundation's mission, I'd like to present you with lifetime honorary memberships. You'll have access to all Foundation programs, voting privileges on the advisory board, and most importantly, a continued connection to a place that was part of your lives. Gerald accepted his frame with shaking hands. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep showing up, Naomi said. Say you'll help us build something that matters. Say you'll tell your story honestly so others can learn from it. We will, Vera promised, her voice breaking. We'll keep showing up. The ceremony continued with speeches from the mayor, from Dorothy Williams representing the former staff, from Jasmine Williams, who played a brief violin solo that left everyone weeping. Then the students from the music program performed a piece they'd been rehearsing for weeks, a complex arrangement that showcased every instrument and every young musician's growing skill. When the official proceedings ended, the crowd mingled on the lawn. Tables had been set up with food and drinks, all catered by a local restaurant owned by one of the former estate workers. Vera found herself in conversation after conversation, hearing stories about the Washingtons she'd never known, learning details about the property's history that added depth to her own memories. She was accepting a glass of lemonade from a waiter when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Mom! Vera turned to find Evan standing there with Chloe beside him. Her son looked good, healthier than she'd seen him in months, his face open in a way it hadn't been since before the wedding. You came, Vera said, pulling him into a hug. I didn't think you would. We almost didn't, Evan admitted. But Chloe convinced me it was important. Chloe smiled, though her expression was still cautious. The revelation of Evan's past had nearly destroyed their marriage, but they'd been working with a counselor, slowly rebuilding trust. I wanted to see the place that's been causing so much upheaval, and I wanted to meet Judge Carter properly, not in the middle of crisis. As if summoned, Naomi appeared beside them. Mr. Bradford, Mrs. Bradford, she extended her hand to Chloe first. We weren't properly introduced at your wedding. I'm very sorry for the disruption I caused. You were fighting for what was rightfully yours, Chloe said, shaking her hand. I understand that now. Naomi turned to Evan, and Vera saw her son's shoulders tense. Mr. Bradford, I owe you an apology as well. When I mentioned your case publicly at the wedding, I violated your privacy. The records were sealed for good reason, and I had no right to expose that information. Evan looked stunned. You gave me a second chance 6 years ago. You could have sent me to prison for 2 decades, but you chose rehabilitation instead. I owe you everything. You owe me nothing, Naomi said firmly. You did the work. You cooperated with investigators, made restitution, completed your probation without incident. You're exactly what the justice system should produce, someone who made a serious mistake and became a better person because of it. I'm proud of how you've handled the last 6 years, and I'm sorry I compromised your privacy. It would have come out eventually, Evan said quietly. Chloe deserved to know. Everyone deserved to know. I spent too many years being ashamed of my past instead of owning it and learning from it. He glanced at the house, at the students still milling around with their instruments. What you're building here, the foundation, the programs, it's what I wish had existed when I was younger. Maybe if I'd had access to something like this, I wouldn't have made the choices that led me to your courtroom. Or maybe you would have, and that's okay too, Naomi said. Redemption isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about learning from them and helping others avoid similar paths. She pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to Evan. The foundation is looking for program advisors who can talk to at-risk youth about real consequences. People who've made mistakes and can speak honestly about how they rebuilt their lives. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss you joining our speaker series. Evan stared at the card like it might disappear if he blinked. You'd want me involved? After everything? Especially after everything, Naomi said. Your story is powerful, Mr. Bradford. Use it to help someone else. Vera watched her son process this offer, saw the way it seemed to straighten his spine, give him a purpose beyond just surviving his past. This was grace in action, not forgetting what happened, but transforming it into something useful. As the afternoon wore on, Vera found herself drawn to the oak tree where so many wedding photos had been taken just months ago. She ran her fingers over the carved initials, JW loves SW 1959, feeling the rough bark and the passage of time. They carved it on their first anniversary, a voice said behind her. Vera turned to find Thomas Carter, Naomi's uncle. My father wanted to mark the moment, said this tree would outlive them all, and he wanted future generations to know they'd been here. He was right, Vera said. The tree's still standing, and now everyone will know they were here. Thomas smiled. Naomi told me what you did. The donations, the advisory board, showing up today even though it must be painful. That takes courage. Or stupidity. I'm still not sure which. It's courage, Thomas said firmly. Stupid would be clinging to anger and righteousness. Courage is admitting you were part of something wrong and trying to make it right. He gestured toward the crowd where Naomi was surrounded by students asking questions about law school and judicial careers. My niece, she's been carrying this burden for so long. The weight of our family's loss, the responsibility of making it mean something. Today, watching her share that burden with others, seeing the foundation actually come to life, it's the first time in years I've seen her look genuinely happy. She's remarkable, Vera said sincerely. She is. But so are you, Mrs. Bradford. Most people in your position would have walked away after the settlement, never looked back. You chose to stay connected to help build something positive. That's rare. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the gardens that both families had loved in different ways, Naomi called everyone's attention one final time. Before we conclude today's ceremony, there's one more announcement. The Foundation has received an extraordinary donation that will allow us to expand our programming beyond what we initially planned. She pulled out a large check, ceremonial but representing very real money. An anonymous donor has contributed $5 million to establish the Restoration Justice Fund. This endowment will support ongoing research into property fraud, legal assistance for families fighting similar battles, and educational programs about housing equity and historical injustice. The crowd erupted in applause. Vera clapped along with everyone else, genuinely moved by the generosity of whoever had made such a substantial contribution. The donor wishes to remain anonymous, Naomi continued, but they asked me to share one message, that restoration requires resources, and those with resources have an obligation to support restoration, even when it's uncomfortable or personally costly. She looked directly at Gerald as she said this, and Vera felt her husband stiffen beside her. She turned to look at him, saw the flush creeping up his neck, the way he was studiously avoiding eye contact. Gerald, she whispered, did you? Don't, he muttered. Not here. But Vera knew. Somehow, her husband had donated $5 million, more than their entire profit from the estate sale, to a cause that contradicted everything he'd claimed to believe during their lowest moments. The man who'd raged about being victimized had just become the Foundation's largest benefactor. After the ceremony ended and most guests had left, Vera cornered Gerald near the parking area. $5 million? Gerald, that's nearly everything we made from selling this place. We still have $7 million, he said defensively. That's more than enough to live comfortably. The rest was just excess. When did you decide this? Why didn't you tell me? Gerald was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sun paint the house in shades of amber and rose. Remember that day in the music room when Dorothy Williams talked about losing her retirement savings and Robert Chen talked about never being able to buy a house? I kept thinking about how easily that could have been us if circumstances were different. We had the privilege of absorbing this loss. They didn't. He turned to face her, and I thought about what Naomi said, about which ending I wanted for our story. Did I want to be the bitter rich guy who lost his mansion and spent the rest of his life complaining about injustice? Or did I want to be someone who used his resources to actually address injustice? You could have told me. I know, but I needed to do this on my own, to prove to myself that I could be better than my worst instincts. He managed a rueful smile. Turns out generosity feels better than righteous anger. Who knew? Vera pulled him into a tight hug, this man she'd been married to for 40 years who could still surprise her. I'm proud of you. Don't be too proud. I'm still annoyed that we lost the house. I still think the whole situation was fundamentally unfair to us. I'm just trying to be the kind of person who can live with unfairness without becoming bitter. They walked back toward the house one last time, taking in the changes. The gardens were slightly overgrown now, less manicured than Vera would have kept them, but somehow more alive. The house itself looked lived in rather than museum perfect, with lights blazing from the music studios and signs of genuine activity rather than staged elegance. Naomi met them at the door. I saw you talking with Gerald. He told you about the donation? He didn't want recognition, Vera said. Why did you announce it? Because anonymous donations let people feel good without being accountable, Naomi said. I wanted him to know that his generosity was seen, that it mattered, that he couldn't just write a check and walk away feeling absolved. Real restoration requires showing up, and I needed him to understand that. She smiled. Also, once people know there's a $5 million endowment, more donations will follow. Gerald just made this foundation sustainable for generations. That deserves to be celebrated, even if it makes him uncomfortable. Damn right it makes me uncomfortable, Gerald grumbled, but he was smiling. Walk with me one more time? Naomi asked. There's something I want to show you. She led them through the house to the music room where the grand piano sat in evening shadows. Naomi sat at the bench and ran her fingers over the keys, not quite playing but feeling the instrument's response. My grandmother used to play every evening at sunset, she said softly. She said it was her way of marking the transition from day to night, from work to rest. It was meditative for her. She played a few notes, then a gentle melody that Vera recognized as Debussy. I haven't been able to play in this room since I bought it back. Every time I tried, I'd just cry. The memories were too heavy. And now? Vera asked. Naomi continued playing, the music filling the room with that remarkable acoustic resonance. Now I'm starting to make new memories. Not replacement memories, but additional ones. The room holds both the past and the present, and that's okay. She looked up at them. That's what I wanted to tell you. This house will always carry the weight of what you lost. But it can also carry the weight of what you built here. The staff you employed, the care you provided, the decision to make amends when you could have chosen bitterness. All of that is part of the story now. Thank you, Vera said, and meant it. Not just for the words, but for the understanding behind them. That their story deserved to be told with complexity. That they could be both wronged and wrong, hurt and healing, all at once. 3 years later, Vera sat in the same music room, now familiar, in an entirely different way, listening to Jasmine Williams conduct a student orchestra. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter had graduated from NYU and was now working as a music therapist at a local hospital, but she'd returned to the foundation to lead the summer program's final concert. The room was packed with families, community members, and foundation supporters who'd become regulars at these events. Vera and Gerald attended every public program, had served on committees, had helped shape policies and fundraise for expansions. The foundation had become part of their lives in a way the estate as their private residence never could have been. Evan and Chloe were there too, their daughter, Vera's first grandchild, sleeping in Chloe's arms. They'd named her Sarah, after the grandmother Evan had never known, but whose legacy had ultimately saved his marriage and given him purpose. He now ran the foundation's youth mentorship program, speaking openly with at-risk teenagers about his own mistakes and the grace he'd been given. As the orchestra played their final piece, Vera felt Gerald reach for her hand. She squeezed back, remembering that terrible day of Evan's wedding when everything had fallen apart. If someone had told her then that she'd end up here, sitting in the house she'd lost, supporting the foundation that had displaced her, grateful for the ways her life had been upended, she would have called them insane. But here she was, and it felt right in ways her previous life never had. After the concert, Naomi found them in the crowd. I have something for both of you. She handed them a book, professionally bound and heavy. The title read, The Washington Estate, A History in Many Voices. The Oral History Project, Vera breathed. She opened it carefully, saw chapters organized by era. The Washington years, the theft, the Bradford stewardship, the restoration. And in the Bradford section, Her own interview transcribed and edited, her story told with honesty about privilege and ignorance and the difficult work of making amends. Your grandchildren will read this someday, Naomi said. They'll know that their grandparents made mistakes but also made them right. They'll understand that justice is complicated and that restoration requires everyone to participate. Vera's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for letting us be part of this. Thank you for choosing to be part of it, Naomi corrected. You could have walked away after the settlement. Instead, you stayed and did the hard work of transformation. That's the real legacy here, not the property or the money, but the choice to keep showing up for justice even when it costs you. As they prepared to leave that evening, Vera paused near the donor wall. Their names were there, along with dozens of others who'd contributed to the Foundation's mission. But beneath the Bradford family listing, a new line had been added. Major benefactors, anonymous, no more. She smiled, thinking about Gerald's reluctant generosity, about how much they'd both changed from the people who'd first bought this estate, believing it could make them important. They'd learned that true importance came not from ownership but from participation, not from possession but from contribution. The sun was setting as they drove away, painting the estate in that same golden light that had illuminated it the day of the Foundation's opening. Vera looked back one final time, seeing students leaving with their instruments, families gathering on the lawn, life and purpose filling every corner of a place that had once been just beautiful and empty. She'd thought losing this house would destroy her. Instead, it had transformed her into someone capable of seeing beyond her own loss to the larger patterns of injustice and restoration. She'd thought Naomi Carter was her enemy. Instead, she'd become one of the most important teachers of Vera's life. Any regrets? Gerald asked as the estate disappeared from view. Vera considered the question seriously. She regretted the pain they'd caused, even unknowingly. She regretted the years they'd spent in that house without understanding its history. She regretted the ways privilege had blinded her to injustice. But did she regret how things had turned out? The foundation, the relationships, the growth they'd both experienced? No, she said finally. No regrets. Just gratitude that we were given the chance to be better than we were. Gerald nodded, and they drove toward their smaller, simpler life. A life defined not by what they owned, but by what they contributed. Not by their address, but by their actions. Behind them, the Washington estate stood as testimony to the complicated work of restoration, a place where past and present, loss and healing, justice and mercy had learned to coexist. And somewhere in that grand music room, in the acoustics that made every note shimmer and resonate, the melody of transformation continued to play, teaching anyone willing to listen that broken things can indeed be made beautiful again, if you're patient enough to understand how they were broken and humble enough to participate in their repair.